for coming, for watching and participating in this. Things are rather crazy right now, so I understand it's a pretty unique time to be engaging and thinking about philosophy. And there's a call now to make our philosophy socially responsive in ways, so hopefully can instigate some good discussions with this. So in this project, I'm motivated by interests in debates about artworks, specifically debates about artworks that take a metaphysical flavor, debates about whether a work properly or genuinely is an artwork or is a member of a given art kind. So in this talk, I'll argue that our engagement in debates about art can be fruitfully understood along the same lines as debates in conceptual engineering. Proposals in conceptual engineering are not evaluated on the basis of their ability to track empirical essences or historical usages of a term or concept, but on the basis of a concept's epistemic, pragmatic, political merits. In the same way, I think we should view membership in a category work of art, as well as subcategories, folk art, sculpture, what have you, not as a fact to be discovered, but as a decision to be made. And I flesh out this core idea by describing a normativist account of aesthetic terms, according to which they do not pick out, do not primarily function to pick out properties in the world, but enable speakers to convey, endorse, and negotiate relevant semantic and behavioral norms. I'll then conclude by showing how this parallel understanding of art and conceptual engineering sheds light on more general issues for conceptual engineers, namely the role of power and legitimizing certain philosophical questions. Okay, so, I gotta click. Nope, I went the wrong way. Here's the plan. I'll briefly introduce the conception of conceptual engineering I'm working with, given the audience. I know everybody's pretty well versed in this, focusing on the idea that conceptual engineers aim to establish new or revised concepts versus track or discover. I'll then discuss sort of a general, brief but large overview of some issues in philosophical aesthetics, focusing on the nature of metaphysical debates about artworks, analyses of the notion of genre, Alva Noe's concept of art as a strange tool, and Dominic Lopes's network theory of aesthetic value. I'll then move on to suggesting that we should take a normativist treatment or framework for methodology in aesthetics. I'll give an overview of what that entails. I'll show how it can capture the dynamic, open-ended, and contestable nature of art practices and concepts, and then show how it provides a new route to competency with aesthetic terms. Then in the end, I'll come back and draw out some lessons for those interested in conceptual engineering. And I just put CE, and that's just tend to slip into that. Okay. So a brief intro into conceptual engineering. As you well know, it's the way I'm framing it, it's understood as the activity of critically assessing our linguistic devices, as Compellin says, I spelled that wrong, namely terms and concepts. And of course, it's contested as to what the object of conceptual engineering is or ought to be. Manuel has a wonderful paper on that. But for current purposes, I'll adopt a pragmatic inferentialist approach, roughly along the lines of Robert Brandam's inferentialism, where a concept is a cluster of inferences, involves application conditions or criteria that guide the concept application, and then there's consequences of the concept application, understood as inferences we are entitled to make or inhibited from making. And further, there's an interpretive common ground whereby members of a linguistic community assume and expect others to use terms in particular ways to draw certain inferences, and they assume and expect others to assume and expect them to use terms in certain ways. It's, I don't think, too important right now exactly what a concept is, and as I'll discuss more in the third and final section, I'm not too sure about the usefulness of concepts for the sort of activity I'm interested in anyway. But the main point is that concepts do not function solely to represent or track features of the world or partitions of logical space. They guide our perceptual attention, awareness, our behaviors, dispositions, and language use. They structure the space of reasons. Concepts determine what counts as a reason for and against us. And as I will put forth throughout this presentation, I think conceptual engineering works best when we assume a dynamic picture of language where it's essentially open-ended and fluid. And I'll draw this out in the final sections. Okay, so proposals in conceptual engineering often involve revised concepts that are stipulated, and this is something Matthew Shields at Georgetown works on, as better suited for performing certain functions or promoting particular consequences, right? Epistemic, pragmatic, practical. And here's a couple of canonical cases. Peter Singer's famous paper, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, I think is an excellent case of conceptual engineering, where he proposes a concept of charity as a duty. And he argues that if this was adopted as a general practice, the understanding that engaging in charitable practices is not a voluntary endeavor, this will in fact promote better consequences, right? The greatest happiness for the greatest number. And he argues that you can't criticize his account on its failure to track how we've used the term in the past. Okay. It doesn't matter that we tend to think of charity as voluntary. Singer says we ought to change our conception of it, think of it as obligatory, and this will lead to better consequences. David Ludwig has recent work on the concept race, where he argues we ought to adopt a political constructionist account of race because it's better suited to enable reasoning about racial inequality, public reasoning about racial inequality. And he gives some empirical cases about reasoning between correlation and causation to justify, to support his claim. And then of course we have Mama Haslinger, her proposal that woman understood as analytically oppressed are better suited for engaging in political solidarity work and emancipatory theorizing. So that's just, right, canonical cases of conceptual engineering. The important part for me is that it's not felicitous to critique such proposals on their failure to capture how things are or how things have been in the past, right? So they're essentially forward-looking. And on my previous work, I've exploited the markers for metalinguistic negotiation to diagnose those projects that I think are most likely to be doing something like conceptual engineering rather than sort of descriptive conceptual analysis or historical analysis. So the soundness of a given proposal is not settled by appealing to the prior use of a term. Speakers adopting a revised concept do so with the awareness that others do not share the same criteria of application or the commitments or expectations of use. They appeal to various social goods, such as better theorizing or promotion of social justice as reasons to adopt one concept over another. That is, that values play a central role in the argument for adopting a particular proposal. And given that conceptual engineers are aiming to establish their proposals, I think conceptual revision, amelioration, like the kind adopted by conceptual engineers, looks more like artistic innovation than scientific discovery. So in that, I kind of want to take that analogy seriously and see where it goes. So it's an activity where we propose a revised way of thinking and talking about using some term. It's informed by historical considerations, but not beholden to them. They're forward-looking, typically prescribed and justified on the basis of anticipated benefits. And again, it's this assumption that language is dynamic. And I think in that sense, aesthetics is more like conceptual engineering than historical analyses, that it has more to do with how we ought to think about art kinds and conventions rather than how we do in fact do it. And I think this observation suggests that aestheticians should adopt a methodology that is more appropriate to this dynamic element. Okay, and in that I switch over to some issues in philosophical aesthetics. It's obviously art and aesthetics are diverse domains and discourses. So I don't mean to say or group all of aesthetic theorizing together or all of artistic practices or art practices together. For the purposes of my talk, I'm focused on issues concerning ontology and metaphysics, although I think many of the things I'm talking about also extend to issues in interpretation and evaluation. Okay, so think about our engagement with art and artistic value. So here you have an image of appropriation artist Richard Prince. His 2016 exhibit is called New Portraits. It is composed of publicly available Instagram portraits that he screenshotted with his phone printed on large silkscreen canvases and sold for upwards of 6 figures. These series incited mass controversy. Many of the people whose photos he used have levied copyright lawsuits against him. This is something that happens to him often in virtue of the fact that he appropriates or uses other people's works for his own works. And so this leads to lots of debates. So imagine 2 people debating over new portraits, and consider the following claims. And these claims are actually taken from debates about Duchamp's fountain. They're formally or structurally very similar. An Instagram portrait cannot be a work of art. You just can't take a screenshot with your phone and call it art. That isn't art by any definition. Art must be original. And if you'd like to rile up your students and get a good discussion going, I recommend showing them Prince's new portrait, right? Very similar claims like these will be made. It's lazy, it's derivative, so on and so forth. So what's going on when we're doing that? Further, think of pervasive debates in aesthetics. I consider debates between philosophers over the nature of various authored works, right? The essential features for being a work of art. For Levinson, it's that it's in some sense inspired or related to previous works. Beardsley, the work of art is an arrangement of conditions intended to be capable of affording an experience. Noel Carroll says a work of art has a narrative connection to previous works. Thomason argues that artworks are intended to be treated in certain ways. Right? And Lopes says they're the product of aesthetic profiles. So it's a common and lively question as to how we can understand what it is to be a work of art, whether they share essential features, some nature, or something like that. Similarly, you can think of debates over the ontology of musical works, whether a musical work is discovered or created, whether it's metaphysically speaking an action or a fictional entity. Right? So there's lively debates in aesthetics about the metaphysical nature of musical works, compositions. Right. Further, a topic that I'm particularly interested in is debates about ontology and appropriation, the conditions under which a given work of artistic appropriation, the use of a pre-existing work, is in fact ontologically distinct from the original. This is things Sherry Irvin works on, most importantly, Darren Hudson Hick. He's done a lot of work on the concept of original and transformative in the nature, in the context of copyright. So legal theory and legal reasoning involving the use of transformative, and the various ontological and conceptual complexities that are raised by our practices of artistic appropriation. Further, sort of more classic philosophical problems, the paradoxes of co-constitution. This is statue in the clay type paradoxes, right? What is it to say that a clay can survive being smushed, but a statue cannot? They seem to have different modal profiles. Similar issues arise with Duchamp's fountain. I know it's kind of a cliche work to use, but I find it to be the most accessible for talking about these issues. Graham Priest in an Aeon article argues that fountain embodies a contradiction. It's art precisely because it is not art. Simon Evening argues that there's no principled way to determine if a fountain is a statue constituted by a urinal or a urinal being used as a statue, and those have different modal profiles. And the idea for Evening is that this metaphysical ambiguity is central to its significance as art. So there's all these live questions, pervasive issues in aesthetics have to deal specifically with metaphysical claims and metaphysical features of various works or kinds. And so as sort of a methodological point, Christy McGuire has argued aestheticians usually take one of 2 methods for determining the metaphysics of a given work or an art kind. One is independence, where artistic practices are taken to constrain and inform metaphysical theorizing, versus deference, which takes more canonical tools from the metaphysician's toolbox, such as parsimony, simplicity, and harmony over practices. Because when you start looking at practices, like in the case of appropriation and copyright law, it gets really messy really quickly. Sherry Irvin and Amy Thomason refer to this as descriptivism versus revisionism. So they're aware, aestheticians are aware, and again, it's a really lively debate now as to what sort of methods are appropriate for understanding these cultural artifacts, right? These important cultural works. So this is all to say that we care not merely about a work's expressive or interpretive properties, but its metaphysical properties. Whether it is, properly speaking, of a given art kind, whether it is the same work over time or through reproduction, whether it's constituted by some non-art materials or merely composed of them, and so on. And here's a great article from 2 years ago, which asks of Richard Prince's appropriation work Cowboys, where he took pictures of advertisements for cigarettes that involve cowboys, with the question, who actually shot cowboys, right? As if this is a live question being asked outside sort of the metaphysician's room, right? So it's not just philosophers who are concerned with this, it's, you know, so-called non-philosophers, everyday speakers, all the way up to philosophers, aestheticians. Okay, so what are we doing when we debate and theorize about the metaphysical properties of artworks and or authored works? And one thing is somewhat trivial is that authored works, historicism about authored works holds that authors are such because they intend to make works to be regarded in ways that previous works have or are regarded. And this suggests a picture of dynamic classification, which is to say a classification of art as belonging to a particular kind or subgenre depends on our practices of categorization themselves. And because of this, art kinds, impressionism, folk art, ready-made, drama, what have you, are essentially open-ended, or maybe something like a family resemblance, and that it's always possible for works to be produced that change the very criteria for classification or success. And this leads me to thinking about the nature of art kinds, right? Or maybe we could talk about genres. The difference between an art kind and a genre is probably something I should look further into, but for the purposes right now, I'm going to think of them as similar. So works typically belong to an artistic genre or tradition, although they can exist prior to the tradition in which they properly belong. And Simon Evnine argues that genres, although he's focusing on the literary genre as science fiction, are metaphysically speaking traditions or historical particulars. So he contrasts the tradition model with a conceptual space model. And in the conceptual space model, the idea is what it is to be a science fiction, sort of determined by a matrix of possible features. It has to do with technology, it has to do with estrangement, and then various works sort of fit in depending on the degree in which they exemplify those features. And Evnine argues that in this conceptual model, conceptual space model, philosophers are tempted to look for features like objects like properties or features to determine what makes a given work a member of a certain genre. So you're tempted to go back into the sort of canonical toolbox for determining, descriptive sort of toolbox for determining what counts as what. But in the tradition model, genres are temporally extended particulars. They can occupy different spatial regions. The persistence of a tradition depends on particulars that compose the tradition, and this can be things like books, rituals, figures of persons, objects, places, and so forth. In the case of genres, these also include things like institutional entities, publishers, auction houses, museums, curators, critics, appreciators, conventions, and award ceremonies or fundings opportunities. So for Evnine, classification of a work as belonging to a genre depends in part on author's intention, but also the judgments and attitudes of the relevant community members. So he argues that author intention is not sufficient or necessary for making a work belong to a given artistic kind. So even if I intend for my work to be perceived as a drama, it could be the case that due to the judgments of the relevant parties, it's considered to be a parody instead of a drama. And I'll talk more about how that comes about here in a second. And in this picture, the boundaries of a tradition are vague. They're open to revision. And again, you need not have any necessary properties for being classified as a member of a tradition. And this is because classification is based on history, right? Importantly, an item's relationship to an exemplar. So for For Evnine, what a tradition is a historical particular. It's extended through time, and it starts in a sense with a particular exemplar. So we take certain objects to be a part of a given tradition in virtue of a relationship that they bear to this exemplar. So you can think Jesus in the case of Christianity. And this is similar to well-known arguments that artistic practices are constituted by norms governing the appreciation of works in a medium. This is something Dominic Lopes says. And further, Evnine draws on Scheffler's work that traditions generate norms and reasons for actions. And importantly for me and for this project, Evnine argues that debates over genre membership appear on the surface to be definitional. Is this X? But they are in fact normative. Should this be X? So when we say, well, is this art? What we're really asking, according to Evnine, is should this be art? Okay. So debates are not really over classification, but over, according to Evnine, agents' conception of a given tradition. Right? And so this involves negotiating the norms for how the work should be treated. So whether work counts as a member of a given tradition depends on the judgments of the relevant community members, or perhaps idealized conventions that guide their reasoning, depending on how you want to cash that out. And it involves a normative element, judgments as to whether a given artifact or object bears the proper relationship to other parts of the tradition or to the exemplar of the tradition. So the idea is that in these cases, this is not something we can simply observe, but it's something we have to decide. And different communities will pick out different features as necessary for being a member of a kind or tradition, such that it's not given a priori whether a given work belongs in a particular genre. Evnine suggests that maybe if every single person agreed that, you know, a certain work belongs in a given genre, then maybe sure, okay, it does, but that's never going to be achieved. Right? So as historical entities, they are essentially fluid, and so cannot be given a definition, right? So definitions are appropriate to things that are sort of static and non-changing. But here we're dealing with something that's fluid, that's open-ended, that's going to look completely different than it does now in 50 years, say. And it all has to do with sort of the history, the trajectory of how we got here versus where we are now. So the idea is there's no procedure for determining if a work really belongs to a certain genre, and it's partially individuated in virtue of the communities on which the tradition depends. Right? This is to say, yeah, I've already said this. Okay, so we're good here. So similarly, Alva in his recent book, Strange Tools, makes the argument that art is a strange tool because it reorganizes our practices in ways that we have no real comprehension or control over. So he says that engaging with art takes us out of our everyday context and assumptions and sort of goings about in the world, and exposes those assumptions and the technologies on which those practices depend. So in the case of appropriation art, you can see that there's a sense in which appropriation artists like Richard Prince are exploiting the technology of reproduction, of mechanical reproduction, photography, phones now, something we do sort of unknowingly in our day-to-day, you know, consuming Instagram feed, for instance. Oops, sorry, I should have turned that off. We got a lot of Houston news going on right now. And so, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so it takes appropriation art is able to sort of take us out of that everyday engagement with images, with reproduction, and gets us to think about it in a way we hadn't before, right? So according to Noe, artworks can pose problems which require investigation. And so he thinks that art, our engagements with art, our evaluations of artworks is a form of research aiming at transformation and reorganization. So he actually thinks that engaging with art is much more like philosophical investigation than straightforward sort of descriptive observation or scientific observation. Noe also says that artists, like athletes, must operate within institutional conventions, which are rules for what counts as playing the same game and as succeeding in that game. However, artists can refuse to play by those rules, and in doing so, change the criteria for assessing what counts as good or as success. And since artworks can be existentially prior to the practices, kinds, or standards of evaluation that they belong to, authors can change the rules of the game while they're playing it. So there's something unique, I think, in the case of artistic innovation and production, in the sense that it leads to these changes in norms and rules, or mere presentation of something. Well, not the mere presentation, but the presentation of something that appeals to other people in a certain way that's non-algorithmic, can lead to these changes, these mass changes in our society. Okay, so Noe further argues, similarly along the lines of Evnine, that aesthetic disagreement is not simply over facts, right? It's something more like philosophical disagreement, pervasive philosophical disagreement. And I guess in many cases, that's the same thing. So he argues that aesthetic disagreement is a kind of philosophical disagreement because they both lack any proof procedure, right? They don't have any way of determining, once and for all things considered, what the meaning of a given work is, what type of thing it is, and what its meaning is. So he says in both art and philosophy, what we're trying to do is get clear about the ways we think and respond and assign value. And this is something, I guess this is like a core element that I'm taking to be shared between conceptual engineering and aestheticizing. Which is that what we're doing is trying to make clear to ourselves how we should go on, and it's not settled by how we have gone on. And so it's really up to us. It's sort of this empowering realization that, oh, hey, I can have a say in this, and here's what I think and why, right? It's not something that's just, well, look here, now it's settled. Here's the book of aesthetic facts, and that's what it says, and that's the end of the question. So Noe goes further than this. He references Kant and suggests that it may be essential to the art encounter that there's no way of adjudicating disputes, right? There's no way of determining who is the real, who's got it really correct, right? The all things considered, once and for all solution to various aesthetic issues. But yet we still want to ask, right, who's right? And there's interesting connections, I think, to T. Wynn's recent work on aesthetic autonomy and aesthetic agency, but I don't have enough space to go through that further. So Noe believes that what's at stake in these disagreements is not the facts, but how we are to assimilate, make sense of, and evaluate those facts. And so whether a musical composition is really a Platonic entity or a phenomenal experience or an action type is neither algorithmic or out there in the world. It's something we have to decide for ourselves. We have to negotiate and make sense of how we should think about it and why. So he sees this engagement as an activity continuous with philosophical investigation. Philosophy is in many ways a way of making our terms strange by taking them out of their everyday embeddedness in our thought and talk and reframing them in ways that enable us to think differently about and with them. All right, so Wittgenstein famously said this is language on holiday. This leads philosophers to many paradoxes and conundrums. But in the next section, I'm going to suggest that actually engaging with these strange, taking language on holiday provides a genuine route to knowledge about how the rules that we think these terms follow, aesthetic terms that guide our reasoning and our engagement with these culturally significant works. So artworks, as I'll be saying, artworks that make strange these everyday conventions and technologies and the concepts that depend on them, provide audiences with novel contexts of application, thus putting them in a better position to understand the rules governing their use. And once you understand those rules, you're in a better position to intervene and change them. Okay, so finally, the third sort of figure in aesthetics that I'm surveying is Dominic Lopes's work on the network theory of aesthetic value. For Lopes, aesthetic values are grounded in a domain's aesthetic profile. So what it is to say that a given work is moving or graceful depends on, so what it is to say that a landscape painting is graceful depends on sort of the correlations between non-aesthetic features and aesthetic value that holds together the aesthetic domain of landscape paintings. So aesthetic practices are individuated in virtue of a domain's aesthetic profile, and the profile is the standards by which we judge works in a given domain. And aesthetic practices have a hierarchical structure, which involves critics, appreciators, works, so on and so forth, very similar to this historical particular conception that Evening's pushing. And the correlation between particular features and standards of success depend on the profile, which is set in part by experts and other community members. So the content of an aesthetic concept, when applied to a given work, depends on the aesthetic profile. So we bring concepts such as graceful or medium-bodied to bear on an item, and in doing so, according to Lopes, we're attempting to work out how that aesthetic property is embodied or not in the work. So according to Lopes, certain non-aesthetic features are taken to provide reasons for evaluating a work or treating it in a certain way. So which features count are a product of the profile and not determined by the non-aesthetic features alone. So he has a very dynamic picture of aesthetic value and aesthetic appreciation, right? So it's not, again, a static thing as to which features count or how we are to interpret or apply a given aesthetic value term like gracefulness. For example, take a landscape painting, Joseph Wright landscape painting. This is something that Lopes uses. Say someone describes this as clunkiness. Right? Clunkiness is taken to have a certain range of non-aesthetic features. The standards for what counts as clunkiness in the case of a landscape painting depends on the profile of that practice. So in this case, it might be certain surface marks, colors, harmony between the objects, and so forth. So for Lopes, aesthetic profiles are malleable. Agents can come to value different features or give more weight to certain considerations over others. Through the charisma or happenstance, certain actors can affect changes in the aesthetic profile of a given domain. So much like, again, Alva Noe's insistence that artists can change the rules while they're playing it. So he argues, long story short, that when we're having a disagreement, what we're actually doing is trying to work out the contours of an aesthetic profile. So we're getting a better understanding of the reasons we have for judging a work or evaluating it in a certain way or along certain dimensions. So he says, only having gone through the exercise of examining items to trace the contours of an aesthetic profile can agents attribute to themselves such traits as having a concept of clunkiness. The core competence for aesthetic agents is competence in aesthetic evaluation, not appreciation. And in this case, competence in aesthetic evaluation is an ability to use these aesthetic terms. The aesthetic terms are concepts that are appropriate to that domain. So we need a way to do work in aesthetics that respects this essential dynamic and essential fluidity at the heart of our aesthetic practices, as well as help vindicate the observation that classification and evaluation is not merely observational. So engaging with art, according to these thinkers, it seems we're doing something more self-reflective and critical, aiming to make sense of our values rather than merely amassing true beliefs about an item. Okay. Oh, sorry. So now on that end, I want to suggest that we adopt a normativist methodology, or at least show the benefits that a normativist methodology has for capturing many of these elements. So Amy Thomason, following in work of the anti-representationalist tradition, Robert Brandom and Hugh Price, has proposed a non-descriptivist approach to modal metaphysical discourse that she dubs modal normativism. So in traditional philosophical theorizing, it's often assumed, not really argued for, that our terms primarily serve to represent features of the world or concepts. And this is taken to be a core tenet of representationalism. So that's the doctrine that our language functions to track, refer, describe, denote independent existing properties, entities in the world. And our linguistic or representational devices are good to the extent that they accurately reflect those features in the world. Further, the existence of properties out there in the world is also what explains their being real and the truth of sentences in which they figure. So this is a form of what she calls explanatory realism. So this has recently come under fire by people like Brandom and Alan Gilbert, who reject the thesis that language singularly serves to track features of the world. And they also reject explanatory realism, the view that facts and properties explain why our claims using various terms are true. So I think it's well suited for sort of theorizing that we want to do in aesthetics. Okay, so Thomason suggests that the descriptivist assumption that operates, again, implicitly in many of our discourses has led metaphysicians into various issues regarding modal epistemology, ontology, and methodology more generally. So according to the normativist, Modal operators, possibly, necessarily, function as particularly useful ways of conveying semantic rules in the object language. So modal operators are not tracking features, but perform a regulative function like the rules of chess. So when we say necessarily all bachelors are unmarried men, we're not describing a feature of the world, but conveying the semantic rule for the terms bachelor and man. You should always endorse claims that equate bachelor, unmarried man with bachelor. I kind of hate this example. Should come up with a better example. So speakers making claims at the object level using a modal operator like possibly are actually pragmatically endorsing, regulating, or challenging the rules associated with the relevant term. So following an idea from Brandom and Wittgenstein, the idea is we first have an implicit grasp of the modal profiles of our terms, which is demonstrated when we apply or refuse to apply, reapply various terms. So when I don't want to call my elephant masterpiece no longer an elephant once it's been smushed, I'm implicitly going or implying the modal rules of clay figurine, right? It's not possible that it can survive being squished. By saying it's possible for a work of art to consist of a pre-manufactured artifact, I'm conveying the permission to use the term in this way and the various norms that are entailed by that use. And this includes behavioral norms on this picture. So how we use terms to think and talk about the world and treat things in the world matters, right? So it's not simply about words, although it's understood in this heavily linguistic framework. I think this is good. So let's reconsider those claims that are made in debates about New Portrait. Okay? Audiences, when you engage genuinely, I guess, or in good faith engage with these sorts of works, you're placed in a space of reasons where you must give a reason for or against a certain judgment or certain use of a given aesthetic term. So if we reconsider the claims A through D, not C, they are in fact incomplete with their implicit commitments that can be made explicit with modal operators. So it might go as follows. Claiming that an Instagram portrait cannot be a work of art is endorsing the rule that artworks must have visual properties that were selected by the author. That's just my interpretation of it, right? That's why it's called derivative sometimes. By saying you can't just take a screenshot with your phone and call it art, you're conveying the rule that art necessarily involves physical creation, which is arguably the operative rule before ready-mades became a legitimate art kind. Saying something like this isn't art by any definition is maybe endorsing a rule that artists should be subject to norms of morality or behavior. You have to ask permission before you use people's things. And to claim that art must be original or may not be derivative is to endorse the rule that necessarily art is original. So one of the upshots of this viewing them in this way is that the normative approach can give us a story of how we gain competency about aesthetic terms, about these rules, the rules that aesthetic terms follow or are guided by. So for Thomason, modal knowledge comes about via implicit competency and mastery of the semantic rules that govern our terms. So she says it's like speaking grammatically. So we often cannot explain how it is that we're able to do things with words or why certain sentences maybe sound funky. But this doesn't mean that we're not engaging or using language grammatically. So just because I'm bad at explicitly stating grammatical rules doesn't mean that I can't, in fact, speak grammatically. So it's a difference of know-how versus know that. So for Thomason and the normativist, speakers can develop mastery and increase their competency by considering possible contexts of application and hypothetical scenarios. And experts are such in part because they have relevant competency or mastery of these terms. So again, the idea being in a certain aesthetic domain. There's also methodological upshots. In the normativist picture, metaphysicians aren't equipped with a special modal perception, or any philosopher, that enables them to observe these properties. Instead, they're particularly well trained to make explicit the actual or possibly optimal rules governing our terms. So the idea is philosophers have more time and more ability to sort of consider various terms in certain constrained theoretical, hypothetical contexts. So they have a better idea, a higher degree of competency with these terms. So it's a kind of a matter of opportunity and practice. In order to parse out the rules, theorists ought to look to empirical work in historical linguistics for one, and experts in various other domains of expertise, depending on the topic, including sociology. So I can't, unfortunately, expand on this further, although I really wanted to, but there's been recent work on sociological analysis of the history of art kinds in Western and US contexts that gives a strong reason to doubt the sort of descriptivist approach to, observational empirical approach to aesthetic kinds, that they seem to be more so socially determined versus, empirically determined. Okay. And in this sense, she argues for the normativist, modal knowledge via semantic rules vindicates the use of intuitions and thought experiments. So thought experiments provide us with these strange and hypothetical contexts that allow us to work out whether a term should or should not apply and why. So the idea for this, though, is an interpretation that thought experiments like the twin earth thought experiment is not something that we can just read off, a descriptivist or Kripkean account of language, right, or rigid embodiment. So instead, the idea is it's always going to be a proposal for how we should think and talk and use a given term, because these are strange contexts of application. So these are like borderline cases. So I guess the idea is for the normativist, the interesting work happens at sort of the borderline cases of our rules. And maybe that's what philosophy is in a certain sense, is trying to hash out these borderline cases, what the rules are. Again, think of the co-constitution paradoxes in metaphysics. Okay. So according to the normativist, thought experiments are a useful route for modal knowledge because they give us a better grasp on what the rules are for a given term. And so I'm arguing that artworks are basically weird thought experiments. They provide us a context for considering novel contexts of application, right? Is an Instagram portrait original? What are the ways in which it could be and why? And this puts us in a position to gain knowledge about the relevant semantic rules governing the terms, or in Lopes's terminology, gives us a higher degree of competency about the terms such that we can get a better grasp on the aesthetic profile. I just said the original thing. Okay, so again, consider original, the concept original. Is it necessary for an artwork to be original? Right? Must an artwork be created ex nihilo in order to count as original? What exactly are the application conditions for originality, right? Can they even be fulfilled? What use is the concept original and what does it do? And so Thomason describes the situation as working out when the term may or may not apply is exercising a mastery of the norms, not a discovery of the possibilities of applying. Okay. And I think another nice point of this, with the normativist picture, is it's compatible with a type of aesthetic ignorance. And I, again, don't really have time to focus on this as much as I'd like. But as Anise has said, speakers are typically not in possession of a complete picture of how we go about distinguishing art from non-art. Right? So we're not fully aware of the ways in which we participate in the art world and reinforce its conventions. And unless it's in principle impossible for us to gain this knowledge, which I don't think is really a tenable position, then we can tell a story about how to develop a higher degree of competency through debating about various works and using aesthetic value, using terms that pick out aesthetic values, right? And working out what that actually entails, assuming you're motivated in the right way. So engaging with artworks. When we engage with artworks, we are working out whether a term may or may not, should or should not apply, which helps us develop competency with the relevant modal terms and aesthetic terms, I think aesthetic, and puts us in a better position to gain knowledge about those rules. And once we're in a better position to understand the operative rules, we're in a better position to change them, to intervene on them, right? So this is a kind of a nice point that Amy Thomason makes in her work on metalinguistic negotiation. If you think of Rosa Parks, a civil rights activist, what she did was refuse to abide by the explicit norms of segregation, of racial segregation. By refusing to sit in the back of the bus, she thereby revealed those norms and critiqued them. So there's this important element of bringing to the surface or making explicit these norms in order to then intervene, challenge, and change them. And so work in feminist metaphysics or ameliorative analyses have argued that engaging in imaginative work on what our concept should be is an important tool right, for emancipatory work in conceptual engineering. Right? So those who want to advocate for a change in the rules can do so by encouraging speakers to consider hypothetical contexts of application, engaging in the imaginative work that helps to destabilize suppositions about word use. And this is related to Rachel Sturken's notion of linguistic intervention, where we can intentionally use terms in ways that flout. She doesn't quite cash it out this way, but I think it can be explained this way. You use terms in a way that flout the operative semantic rules in order to cause a misunderstanding in their audience. And Robin Dimbroff and Daniel Vodak have a forthcoming paper where they reference some feminists, I think it's Israeli linguistic feminists, who purposely flout the gender rules for their language as a way to draw attention to sort of the essential, how essential gender is in our language and need not be. So there is this idea that conceptual engineering, ameliorative work, involves this flouting, making explicit these rules that we're abiding by. Purposely flouting these rules can cause a misunderstanding, which leads to a breakdown in communication and, at least ideally, encourages the hearer or the audience to reflect on language use. And Jonathan Neufeld has a similar point. He calls it aesthetic disobedience. The idea being artists can also purposely flout conventions or rules as a way to draw attention to those conventions in the hope of refining them. So what I'm trying to say really is very similar things are going on in conceptual engineering, as well as sort of artistic production and practices, all the way up to the theoretical level. Lopes also, he seems to be operating in a more representationalist framework, but I think it can be easily translated over to normativism. He has this great point that aesthetic value concepts, such as clunky and elegant, are notoriously vague when we try to use them out of context, but extremely precise when applied to specific items and specific practices, right? So again, we need various weird things to try to apply them to get a better idea of what they apply to, how they work. And I think this entails that we need a diverse diet, go back to a Wittgensteinian point, we need a diverse diet of artistic works, of work done in other domains, interdisciplinary work, studies on various terms and concepts in order to work out the rules that these concepts follow, right, so that we can change them, again, for conceptual engineers. And I think the normativist has a different route to aesthetic agency, which according to Lopes is to work out our competency of certain aesthetic terms, getting a better idea of aesthetic profile. Well, here we have an idea of how to do that. We need to study how others have used the term. We need to consume and engage with various works that challenge us to work out whether a term should or should not apply, right? And instigate discussions and debates with others. And this is something, some other work I have with inferentialism suggests as well, which is that disagreement is actually a really good thing, assuming it's a type of faultless disagreement, because it calls on us to give reasons behind various proposals, right? Make explicit why we think certain concepts should or should not apply, which is, again, a step towards changing things. Okay, so my claim has been artworks are a strange tool for developing competency and mastery of our relevant semantic rules governing our terms, and also provide a context for us to advocate for changes in those rules. And again, this is best understood when we are employing modal terms in our claims about aesthetic works. So they function like thought experiments, are hypothetical scenarios, and enabling audiences. Maybe I should think more like borderline cases, right? So they're almost like, I'm almost defining them as borderline cases, enabling us to work out our conditions of application in a way that there is no settled answer, right? So again, the important point is that although we want to get it right, the idea is it's not simply just a fact out there that we can observe and then it settles the issue, right? So because it's fluid, we're constantly trying to get a better grasp on really what these concepts entail in various aesthetic domains. And in cases where the rules don't settle the question at issue, which I think is many of the cases in philosophy, we need to engage in more explicit metalinguistic negotiation or conceptual engineering. And I think I've basically just said that. So again, many of the kinds of cases that I'm concerned with or that I surveyed in the beginning of the second section are ones where it doesn't seem like our rules are going to settle the question at issue. So we should be more explicit with the fact that these are proposals and what that entails. And I don't really have time to focus on this, but I think even though I use the term art in my title, this suggests that we might want to move away from using the concept art in our theorizing about art, insofar as this leads us to think that it's a much more static endeavor than what it really is. So philosophers should be understood as intervening, revising, or regulating uses of aesthetic terms and the associated norms. And this is the same sort of thing that philosophers are doing when they're engaging in conceptual engineering. So artworks, I say, are like scientific anomalies. They call on us to reflect on and refine our tools for thinking and talking about them. So in the case of scientific anomalies, Pluto didn't purposely intend to flout the conventions associated with being a planet, but in the case of Duchamp's fountain, he arguably did intend to flout those rules, and in doing so changed them. Not that the change was up to him or his intentions. I still think this is compatible with an externalism about being a work of art or aesthetic value. So just briefly, probably the part you're most interested in, here's some lessons that we can draw from this for conceptual engineering. I think one is that different questions arise for conceptual engineering when we look at work on metaphysics and the meta-semantics of artifacts and artifactual terms. And this is just really a plea for my own work, in a sense, that it seemed like a lot of, say for like Haslinger's work, a lot of like what Capellan is drawing on, and it seems a lot, even Haslinger to a certain extent, is work that was done drawing on natural kinds. And so it presents a more static conception of meaning, of reference, of concepts. So I think when you look at artifactual and social kinds, it's more clearly apt that we adopt something like a psychological theory of concepts, where they're more closely tied to behavior and practical implications of concept application. It also suggests a sort of world-first conceptual engineering, understood as responsive to worldly affairs. Again, the presentation of an Instagram portrait in the context of being a work of art, not that it's justified on the basis of tracking features in the world. And artworks, again, do intentionally what scientific anomalies do unintentionally, so further understanding how we can intentionally lead to these changes in rules and norms. And I think further work can be done on exploring things like marriage as an abstract artifact. And in fact, Haslinger has a forthcoming piece that I just read like last week, and I'm super excited about, because she suggests that we can understand concepts as participating in a representational tradition, and that marriage might be more like a ritual. So I want to take that analogy seriously and see where that goes, and see how we understand meaning continuity and changes in conceptual application conditions or inferences in this more dynamic picture. So we should jettison these static theoretical constructs like externalist content, reference, and meaning. We should embrace something more like Mark Richard's recent work on meaning as species, where he says meaning is more process or event-like, which is compatible with understanding them as species, which are historical particulars. So instead of a natural kind notion of historical particulars, I am suggesting an artifactual conception of a historical particular. And Thomason's forthcoming, she has a suggestion that we should focus on words instead of concepts. Again, under this worry that concepts encourage a more static conception of things. So I think we might want to think more seriously about what it means to say that meaning is more like a genre or a tradition than a property or a semantic value. And then on that end, it seems that once we take a different object as bottom-up starting point for our conceptual engineering and our theorizing about it, different questions seem more pressing. And I think a lesson we can draw from looking at aesthetics and art kinds is that what questions or issues are seen as legitimate is partially a matter of who is in a position to make a proposal, right? So like Evening suggests on genres, convergence of interpretation is a product of power. And I think similarly, the way that the literature and conceptual engineering is going, the sort of questions that are taken up right, are inspired in part by like work by Herman Capellen in Fixing Language. And not that I don't think that that's a good book. It sets out very important problems for us to focus on. There's a sense in which it started a tradition, and now our own tradition, the tradition of conceptual engineering as an explicit domain of inquiry, sort of beholden to the questions that he's posed. So coming from noticing a parallel between aesthetic discourse, aesthetic theorizing, and conceptual engineering, then it seems there is no sort of a priori fundamental question for philosophers or even philosophers of language. So it's kind of going into this, I think Simeon has this point where it's like, we might as well just make as many concepts as possible, variation all the way, and see what blooms, right? Let 1,000 flowers bloom and see what happens. So I think more so on that camp, versus sort of trying to make sense of how we can do conceptual engineering and sort of pre-existing frameworks like externalism. And of course, this calls for more empirical work, working linguistics and sociology and psychology. And on that, I say thank you. Yes.